Part 1. The Courtroom Reckoning. You folks never learn, do you? Officer Travis Malone sneered, his voice thick with disdain as he seized her arms. His grip tightened, twisting them behind her back with a force that felt more like a taunt than a necessity. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, snapping shut with a sharp click that echoed through the cavernous courtroom. The sound hung in the air, yet no one stirred. No one flinched. To the onlookers, it was just another day, another black woman dragged down, another story too small to ripple past the evening news. Serena Miles felt their stares like pinpricks across her skin, dozens of eyes, some glinting with cruel amusement, others dulled by apathy, none softened by care. A suffocating silence blanketed the room, heavy with judgment, pressing against her chest. The courtroom walls, adorned with the hollow emblems of justice, scales, gavels, faded banners, closed in, their grandeur shrinking into a trap. Whispers slithered through the stillness, traded among the spectators with calculated venom. She really thought she'd beat this, one hissed. Always the same excuse, another muttered. She should have known her place. Judge Walter Preston loomed behind his towering desk, a figure of authority cloaked in boredom. His gavel dangled lazily in his fingers, tapping the wood in a slow, deliberate rhythm, a countdown to the inevitable. His gaze flicked toward her for a fleeting moment, then drifted away, as if she were a minor inconvenience. Serena had felt this before, this shrinking, this erasure in the eyes of those who saw her as less than human. It was a choreographed dance of injustice, playing out with ruthless precision, the system humming along as it was built to do. Yet she stood tall, not because the pain didn't sting, not because the rage didn't burn, but because she'd never give them what they craved, her fear, her surrender, her defeat. Prosecutor James Carver stepped forward, his polished loafers clicking against the marble floor as he approached the jury. Middle-aged, draped in a crisp black suit that screamed privilege, he carried a stack of papers in one hand, the other gesturing with theatrical flair. His voice, smooth and edged with false certainty, filled the room. This woman, he declared, pausing for effect, was caught with stolen goods in her possession. He waved a single sheet before letting it drift to the evidence table. We've got her on camera. We've got witnesses, signed statements. And yet, he turned, his gaze locking onto Serena, dripping with contempt. She claims it's all a mistake. A misunderstanding. His lips twisted into a smirk. Tell me, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, how many times have we heard that one? Laughter rippled through the room, soft but cutting, a blade slipping through the air. Malone, standing behind her, snorted, shaking his head. They always say that, he muttered. Serena's stomach knotted, not from dread, not from panic, but from a fury that coiled tighter with every jeer. They mocked her openly, secure in their belief that no one would challenge them, that no one would name this sham for what it was. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself, her hands clenching against the icy cuffs. Judge Preston sighed, straightening in his seat as if the proceedings had worn him thin. Enough drama, he grumbled, his eyes settling on her. His face was a mask, unreadable, but his verdict had been etched long before she'd stepped through those doors. The evidence is clear. The prosecution's case is solid. I see no reason to drag this out. Her chest tightened, not from shock, not from fear, but from the bitter echo of familiarity. She'd seen this before, the cold, mechanical denial of justice, the rehearsed display of power, the illusion of fairness. Her trial had ended before it began. She scanned the room. The jury, 12 faces, handpicked to guarantee one outcome, watched with detached curiosity. Spectators ranged from eager voyeurs to the idly bored, none troubled by her fate. Reporters scribbled furiously, crafting the downfall of yet another black woman into headlines that would prop up the system's cruelty. At the back, officers stood with arms crossed, their smirks barely concealed, savoring her supposed defeat. Preston tapped his gavel, a faint, taunting gesture. For these reasons, he intoned, his voice flat, I find the defendant. But Serena stopped listening. Not to him, not to any of them. They thought this was her breaking point, the moment she'd bow her head and let shame settle into her bones. They had no idea who they'd cornered. They'd humiliated her, stripped her dignity bare before a packed courtroom. But what would they do? What could they do when they realized the woman they'd just sentenced wasn't just another victim of their game? What would they do when they learned that the person they'd falsely accused, ridiculed, and dismissed was Commander Elise Jordan, one of the nation's top intelligence officers? That the very soul they'd so casually tossed into their furnace of corruption held every one of their secrets in her grasp? The courtroom thought they'd won. They thought they'd scripted the ending. But this wasn't the end, it was the opening salvo. And when the truth broke free, the world would watch their empire of arrogance crumble. The heat of Montgomery. The Alabama sun bore down on Montgomery, a relentless weight that clung to the skin of those gathered outside the courthouse. The grand building, with its towering white pillars and stern stone facade, had stood as a sentinel of power for decades, a power that had never truly served everyone. A crowd swelled at its steps, their voices rising and falling in waves of fury, exhaustion, and defiance. Protesters hoisted signs high, their faces taut with the strain of yet another injustice unfolding in plain sight. Some chanted, their words sharp and rhythmic. Others stood in silent vigil, their presence a testament to a truth they'd lived too many times. They knew this script, had seen it, felt it, endured it. The system didn't bend for people like them. Inside, the air was just as heavy, though no one would admit it. The ceiling lights buzzed faintly, casting cold shadows across polished wood and worn leather. The scent of old paper and wax hung in the sterile space, a place where lives were rewritten with a single gavel's fall. At the defendant's table sat Naomi Evans, her posture rigid, her face a mask of calm, though her mind churned like a storm. She felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken assumptions pressing down like a vice. The jury sat stiffly, a curated dozen whose verdict had been decided before she'd entered the room. Their blank gazes, subtle frowns, and fleeting glances told her everything. They'd never linger long enough to see her humanity. Naomi had spent her life fighting battles she shouldn't have had to. Born in Mobile, Alabama, where being black meant being watched, doubted, questioned at every turn. She'd defied those chains, shattering records by 20, climbing the ranks of intelligence with a mind sharper than her doubters could fathom. She'd cracked cases no one else could touch, outsmarted criminals and corrupt officials alike, proving her worth in a world that refused to see it. But here, none of that mattered. Here, she wasn't Naomi Evans, the decorated operative. She was just another black woman in handcuffs. Prosecutor David Hensley moved with the ease of a man who'd never questioned his place, his navy suit pristine, his demeanor polished to a fault. He paced before the jury, gesturing smoothly, his voice dripping with rehearsed certainty. This woman, he said, pausing for effect, motioning toward Naomi without a glance, was caught with stolen property. The evidence is undeniable: surveillance, witness testimonies. Yet she insists she's the victim. He faced the jury, his tone thick with mockery. How many times have we heard that excuse? A few jurors shifted, his words planting seeds of doubt. He smirked. It was too easy. Behind her, the officer who'd cuffed her chuckled softly. They always say that, he muttered. Naomi's fingers curled into fists, the cuffs biting into her wrists. She exhaled, controlled and steady, as Judge Clarence Dutton sighed, his gaze shifting to her with weary finality. Enough theatrics, Mr. Hensley, he said, his tone of formality. We've seen the evidence. The prosecution's case stands. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, capturing what they thought was her fall. But they didn't see her, not really. They thought she'd break. They thought they'd won. But Naomi Evans wasn't just anyone. And when they realized who they'd accused, Commander Lena Pierce, a federal agent with secrets that could unravel them all, it was too late. The courtroom doors burst open, federal agents stormed in, and the smug certainty shattered. Hensley paled, Dutton froze, and the officers stiffened as the truth hit. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey. The judge at the door. Leah Coleman was late again, her sedan screeching to a halt outside the New Orleans courthouse. The dashboard clock glared. 10 minutes until the trial. Her pulse raced. This wasn't just any case. Today, she'd preside over a racial profiling suit that could shift Louisiana's legal landscape. A black judge with years of grit behind her. Leah had faced her share of storms, but this one felt personal. The defendant, Jamal Tate, had been arrested in his own neighborhood for no reason, a story too close to her own scars. She strode across the lot, heels clicking, opting for the side door to dodge the media swarm at the main entrance. As she neared, a young white officer, Ethan Reed, blocked her path, his stance rigid, ice cold. "Ma'am, I need ID," he snapped, his tone sharp. Leah raised an eyebrow, lifting her badge. "I'm Judge Coleman, presiding over the Tate case." Reed didn't budge, scanning her with suspicion. "There's been an incident nearby. You match the description. I need answers." The irony hit her like a punch. Here she was, about to rule on profiling, being profiled herself. "The trial starts in 10 minutes, she said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "I need to get inside." Reed's hand hovered near his cuffs. "I don't care who you say you are. You're coming with me." Before she could respond, an older black officer, Sergeant Roy Bennett, intervened. "Stand down, Reed," he barked. "That's the judge." Reed muttered, stepping back, but the damage was done. Inside, Leah presided over Jamal's testimony, raw, wrenching, a mirror to her mourning. Then Reed took the stand, his arrogance replaced by unease. His story crumbled under scrutiny, revealing the truth. Jamal's arrest was baseless, driven by bias. The jury found Reed guilty of wrongful arrest, And as the room buzzed, he stood, voice shaking. I was wrong, Your Honor. I'm sorry. Leah's reply was firm. Sorry doesn't undo the harm. This runs deeper than you. It was a start, but not the end. Change, she knew, came piece by piece. The nurse on Vine Street. Brandon Hayes slumped out of Cincinnati General's ER, exhaustion etched into his bones after a 12-hour shift. The spring night was crisp, the streets humming faintly as he headed home. 10 blocks, a familiar decompress. But near the convenience store, tension crackled. A crowd gathered, watching two officers confront a man. Brandon kept walking, until a baton slammed into his arm. Pain flared, sharp and sudden. He stumbled, clutching his scrubs. I was just walking home, he said, voice low but steady. The young officer, Nate Crowley, froze, his baton slipping as regret flickered in his eyes. The older cop, Officer Paul Grayson, barked, move along, but the crowd, phones up, voices rising, wouldn't let it slide. You hit an innocent guy, someone shouted. Brandon stepped forward, arm throbbing. Why'd you hit me? Crowley stammered. I thought you were reaching for something. Brandon's laugh was bitter. I was scratching my arm. The crowd pressed in, recording, waiting. Crowley's shame broke through. I messed up, he admitted. Brandon nodded. Yeah, you did. So do something about it. Crowley vowed to report himself, but Brandon wasn't convinced, not yet. As he walked away, the camera stayed on. This wasn't over. It was a spark. Reflection. How many times has this played out? Silenced voices, buried truths, a system rigged to ignore them. Serena, Naomi, Leah, Brandon, they're not just stories. They're warnings, truths cloaked as fiction, echoes of reality. What happens when the powerless fight back? What if they didn't have the tools to turn the tide? Drop your thoughts. What would you do? Because these aren't just tales. They're the start of something bigger. Subscribe if you believe the truth should win.